Hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We are so thrilled you're here. Greg, you want to lead us in and we'll get to all the great details about Patricia Park, who's here today.
Indeed. Very excited. Firstly, welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, and featuring imposter characters in their stories, as well as the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives. Let's geek out on the things that fuel and challenge the most talented minds.
So today we are thrilled to have Patricia Park here. She is the author of the award-winning novel Re Jane, which is a Korean-American retelling of Bronte's Jane Eyre, and the YA novels Imposter Syndrome and Other Confessions of Alejandra Kim, which was an NPR Best Book of 2023 and a Gotham Book Prize finalist, and What's Eating Jackie O. And she's a tenured professor of creative writing at American University, a Fulbright scholar, an Edith Wharton Writer-in-Residence, a Jerome Hill Artist Fellow, and the recipient of numerous awards. She has written for the New York Times, New Yorker, Guardian, and others. And Patricia was born and raised in Queens, New York, and all of her novels are linked in the Queens multiverse. Welcome.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Greg. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. This is very exciting.
Yeah, let's talk imposters and imposter syndrome.
I love it. Well, firstly, I'm going to say a couple things right off the bat. Listening to Liz go through your resume, I'm feeling intimidated.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a very decorated resume, and I always immediately have that knee-jerk reaction of how is this person who has this kind of resume the length of my arm going to have imposter syndrome. But
right.
but the flip side of that coin is you are also in a way the ideal guest because you have a title that is literally imposter syndrome. So I think this will be a very interesting and enlightening conversation, I think, for us and for our listeners.
Thanks. Well, having literally written the book on imposter syndrome, this is like the one area I feel like I can own it with some sense of like bravado and confidence.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
Well, I just spent the week reading your amazing novel, one of three, Imposter Syndrome and Other Confessions of Alejandra Kim, and I just loved it. You know, I'm not exclusively a YA reader. I kind of go through phases, but you know, I was so impressed and amazed in how beautifully you captured this teenage voice.
Absolutely.
And you know, I think one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, you know, is writing a character who is younger than you and, you know, in a different period of her life as you are, is there some imposter syndrome that came up in that process?
As you were both talking, I had like so many waves of when I felt like an imposter or having imposter syndrome. For one, just moving into the genre, writing YA, writers are a snobby bunch, right? And, oh, you weren't published in the New York Review of Books. You didn't write for Harper's. So, Greg, thanks for the kind words about my resume. But, like, all I can see are, like, all the things I didn't get. Like, 5 times applying to Breadloaf and never always getting rejected, not even hoping for a Guggenheim, etc. And YA, too, I came from the adult world. And there's a lot of snobbery about the craft of it too, right? Like, oh, it's somehow lesser or it's like kiddie. But I think, so Liz, thanks so much. Like what you're saying is so meaningful to me because I think hopefully characters that feel well-rounded and authentic will find a way to touch readers who are outside of that experience or beyond their teen years. But just from a craft perspective, hells yeah, I had imposter syndrome trying to nail the voice of Alejandra. I had the first line, went through so many iterations. In one version of the line, it was like, when you have a name like Alejandra Kim, teachers stare at you like you're a clerical error. And I'm like, I had my 12-year-old niece like vet the line. She's like, what's clerical mean? And I'm like, oh, you've never had to deal with clerical errors, hence ergo not knowing what a clerical error is. And so it was just like nailing the voice word by word, and thinking about the syntactical decisions, thinking about diction, and then thinking about the larger kind of emotional landscape of a teen. Because I think YA, what it does best and how it can be different from adult fiction is that it drops you into the immediacy of the teen experience.
Mhm.
And so you want the reader to feel like they're living it in real time along with the main character.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was there a point in the process when you feel like you really, clicked in and locked into that voice? Can you remember that during the writing process?
Yeah, it was a couple of drafts in,
Okay.
I'd say. And I think this is one of the benefits of I have a long commute. I live in New York.
Mhm.
I teach in
Right.
DC. And before that, when I was in high school, I lived in Queens. I went to high school in the Bronx. So hours a day on public transportation is just like my norm.
Right.
And I
Mhm.
overhear a lot. I'm the nosiest person ever with my little notebook, or like now my notes app, because of technology.
Sure.
And so I just overhear a lot of conversations of people of all different age ranges, demographics, etc. So I think that process just by osmosis has been helpful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But in later editorial process where I'm like, yeah, I nailed it. I'm like, yeah, I nailed it. And my editor's like, I mentioned payphones and postage stamps, and my editor is like, who is like 2 decades older than me, I think. She's like, do teens know what payphones are? And I'm like, yeah, they do. And I'm like, wait, do they?
Right.
And then had another wave of imposter syndrome, not knowing
Mm.
what the F felt like I was doing.
Right.
Fun fact, I fact checked with my students and they said, yes, they have heard of this thing called a payphone.
Could they point one out in the wild?
Please. It might have to have like a sign in neon, like this is a paper, or one of those like natural history museum kind
Right. The
of.
placard.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Nice.
Relics from our past.
Yeah.
Well,
Like,
it's so great to hear that, you have kind of access to your niece and to your students, for kind of like, is this anachronistic or not? And I feel like you got all of those details, done perfectly. The thing I was so struck by was the kind of emotional quality. And you have this main character who is, in a kind of fish out of water situation, and she's confronting racism and classism, and that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, when you were getting into the character or the story, kind of what came first. Was it inspired by her feelings of being an imposter, or was it inspired by the kind of like story and then that drove her character?
um, yeah, I'm trying to think. I think a lot of teens, or a lot of young people, especially coming of age in New York,
Mhm.
they're dealing with a lot. And I think for us to say like YAO, it's simplistic. It's like one storyline. That isn't the case, because when I talk with a lot of teens, they have so much on their plate. They're dealing with like family issues, economic issues, high school friendship, and all of these kinds of big emotional stakes, all these
Mhm.
big emotional
Yeah.
stakes, these T-bones of stakes. um, and you guys are very kind for laughing. With my students, I actually do a stakes exercise. We do like, when we're trying to talk about, say, the differences between adult and YA fiction, and we'll do this exercise of things that were high stakes when you were 17 years old,
Mm.
things that are high stakes when you're 40 years old, and then what are kind of perennial stakes in the middle.
Mm.
So um oftentimes those stakes are tied to like a concrete thing. So when you're 17, it's like, oh my God, the prom, maybe, or your friend group, or are you wearing baggy jeans,
Mm.
or are we going to make fun of the millennials wearing skinny jeans? Like, college applications. But when you think about and when you're 40, like a mortgage or this or that, marriage, divorce. But when you think about the emotional stakes that are tied to it, oftentimes they kind of meet in the middle. So it's questions of, okay, maybe it feels like it's about the prom, but it's actually about acceptance.
Mhm.
Am I a worthy member of society? Can I participate in this way? Am I perceived as attractive? Or friendship groups and so forth. So Liz, I think it's just like a soup. I'm just like thinking about
Mhm.
all the soupy elements, the what emotionally is going on, and then tying it to a kind of a concrete journey or concrete desire that
Mhm.
would be relevant or age appropriate for, in Alejandra's case, a 17-year-old who is coming of age.
Right.
Mm.
There's something I'm curious about, because I speak with friends who have kids who are kind of that general age range, or my nephews who are not too far past that age range themselves. And I wonder, there's such a difference between when, let's say, any of us were that age versus now in terms of technology and the sort of rate of that exponential rate of growth that happens. And I wonder, when you're talking about stakes, do you feel like, is there a different sort of set of considerations, or maybe range of stakes that has changed from, let's say, when you were the age of Alejandra and her friends to now, when like the kids that you talk to and talk, about this kind of stuff, the kids you teach or family members, is there, do you see, is there kind of a marked difference from what you remember when you were that age?
For sure. I mean, we have such shorter attention spans, and kids who grew up with technology, unlike myself,
Right.
they're like, tell your story walking, or like they needed it yesterday.
Yeah.
And already as a New Yorker, I'm like, I needed this yesterday, but they're like, we needed this, like, say it in a 5-second TikTok reel.
Right.
And I'm like, oh.
Right.
One thing though that I have embraced with technology, because I was, I'm not only am I, like an elder millennial, but also I'm a bit of a Luddite, so I'm even
Same.
further lagging.
Same.
And so I have that brings up all kinds of impostery feelings, and I can never figure out like how to do this thing on your iPhone.
Right.
But one thing I've embraced is the use of technology actually in storytelling. Not like, okay, iPhone 15 Max, blah, 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 or these specs, but more like using text messages as a quick way to get in and out of a scene.
Yes.
So, for us as traditional storytellers, you have character A and B, you have to like set the stage, meet for coffee, plant a reason why they have to meet, and then character A has to tell character B about, they've got to deliver a message. And actually using technology without naming the technology, or just like texting, for example, could be a quick 2-liner to get two characters in a scene together, relay some important information told in the character's voice, and then get out of there. So that's actually something I've been something actually that my editor taught me, and she's like, hey, why don't you use text? And I'm like, you never use technology. That's not the way. How will you write the great American novel if you've got like beepers in it, or it becomes as obsolete as a beeper? It started as a payphone.
Right. How topical is that thing versus the timelessness you want to achieve?
Exactly. Yeah.
So many thoughts. It's funny you mentioned the texting, because Greg and I just got a round of the page designs for our next book, and we also utilize texting. And one of the questions is, the actual appearance of the text on the page. Are they bubbles? Are they this? And it's just, I kind of share the sentiment, like, how could it be the great American novel? How is this like of literary merit if we've got, text bubble?
LOL.
Right.
Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, oh man.
But, I think to your very wise point, it's kind of unavoidable if we're going to capture, like the zeitgeist of younger people, and not even younger people. I mean, we're adults. We all use text messages. And I think it's a really effective way to, find a good tone, find pacing. You can do a lot with a shorter amount of words. And I think it really can also tell a lot about a character just in how they like text shorthand. Like even that has kind of become a form of language expression. So I love that. And I was also just wondering, because you're a professor of writing, where do you fall on this kind of question that, can writing be taught? And do your students kind of come in feeling like they're writers, or that they want to be writers? What's that experience like?
Yeah, who is it? Flannery O'Connor. She's got strong words about writing not being able to be taught. Or when I think about myself and how much I have grown as a writer, just based on concrete tools that I didn't know about, I'm like, damn, like anybody could do it. I don't, I don't, okay, not just like any schmo off the street. I think if you just have like a sense, an ear for musicality, an ear and an eye for detail or for observation, if you're able to kind of look a little bit outside of your own scope of things, I think if you just have those two main tools or a willingness, then I think you can learn a lot of the craft. A lot of it is, studying other texts, seeing how syntax and diction move sentence by sentence, word by word,
Mhm.
catching rhythms of dialogue and speech, and studying story structure, um, doing character exercises, and so forth. Yeah, I think the people that you can't teach writing to are people who, again, they can't look outside of an experience outside their own.
Mm.
Mhm.
And sometimes you meet those, sorry, those, sometimes they're dudes, or sometimes you meet those people at like a cocktail party. They're like, oh, you're a writer? Yeah, yeah. Oh, I got a life story too. Like, why don't you write my life story? And I'm like,
Right.
oh, Jesus Christ.
There you go.
And it's always like, they always have that accent too.
They do.
I'm
It's
like,
amazing.
okay, why don't I put my dreams on hold
Yeah.
so then I can tell your story?
Right.
Like, what's up? Should, should we talk through those billable hours? Like, that doesn't make any
Right.
sense.
So you're talking about so what you're trying to suggest is someone who doesn't necessarily lead with empathy might not be the best storyteller, and you know,
Greg, you said it better than I. Empathy, yes. I
documentarian of
was like,
the
let me
human
say
condition.
20 words when one will do.
Well, I mean, you really set me up for that one, so I was just riffing off of you. What for you was that? What kind of started you on that journey? Do you remember distinctly? Was there a moment that it occurred to you that you knew you wanted to be a writer? Was it something you sort of that came together? Was it a moment, a flash? Was it sort of more of a long lead on that? What was your experience?
I think, well, I knew from a very young age, and I think it was just always feeling kind of out of place
Mhm.
or lonely, or you never belonged.
Mhm.
You know, I was born and raised in Queens,
Right.
so someone who looks like me, my parents are Korean by way of Argentina, and but they're naturalized Americans.
Right.
Like, you look at me, you're like, all right, do you speak English?
Mm.
You speak English without an accent. What's up with that?
Right.
So already, like, okay, mainstream America doesn't think I'm mainstream American. Fine, we already know that minority in quotes story. But then there's another layer of loneliness where, I'm from Queens, which is the most ethnically diverse place in the
Yeah.
world. It's statistically, yeah, the most, and I grew up within the Korean enclave in Queens. So you would think like, okay, I belong there. But then again, I felt very distanced from that community. I felt like I didn't belong. There were a lot of markers that made me separate, or people are like, why aren't you acting this way? Why do you talk so white? Why do you do that? Why isn't your hair like stick straight and shiny? Why aren't you like a size 00? And so I don't know. There were a lot of things. Why do you have so many questions? Um, and I feel like I think so many of us writers have that version of like, you want to get out of
Yeah.
Dodge,
Yeah.
and feeling like you don't belong where you are. And when you don't belong, you're able to look at a society or a group or an experience a little critically, like outside of that
Mhm.
experience. And that was what led me to wanting to be a writer, and I've wanted to be one since I was like 6.
Wow.
So very early on, yeah.
I imagine that has to be almost doubly kind of confounding or alienating too, when you are, as you mentioned, you are like, we'll say, in quotes, a minority, and you're living in the most diverse, one of the most diverse places in the world, and yet you still don't feel like you fit into any one pocket. I mean, that's got to be really, that has to exacerbate what already feels like a very alienating situation.
Great. Thanks for being so empathetic. Yeah, I do feel like it is a particular loneliness of not feeling, yeah, that double sense of alienation, like not even belonging to this minority
Right.
group you're supposed
Within
to
the thing.
belong
And I mean, you do such a wonderful job in the book Imposter Syndrome of doing that through Allie's eyes and through her experience of kind of talking about that, right? Of, not being Korean enough and not being Argentine enough and not being enough of any of these things. And then going to this,
Rich enough.
rich enough, grounded enough,
Mhm.
yeah, it's really amazing the way you convey that in the story.
Thank you so much.
Well, you've touched on already, I think, a number of times and places in your life that imposter syndrome has come up for you outside of your characters. How are some ways that imposter syndrome manifests in your life today, would you say?
Um, I think you never kind of get over imposter syndrome. I think you just kind of level up like a video game, right? You've like reached level 1 and then reached level 2. And then sometimes it's like you lose a life, and so you have to go back to the previous level.
I like the
You're
analogy.
like, wait, I thought I was leveling up, and then suddenly, oh, you died, and then you got to go
Yeah.
back. So I meet with a lot of high school students, and they ask me, they're like, how do you solve imposter syndrome? Like, what's the cure? And I so in my heart want to say, all right, do X, Y, and Z, boom, cured. You're cured.
Right.
It's a
You
miracle.
got it.
But I have to be honest, and I say, look, like, so the things that bothered me, when I was your age, like, okay, I'm going stag to the prom. Oh, I'm gonna buy this Jessica McClintock dress. Oh, like what cut do I get it in the crimson, or do I get it blue? Oh my gosh, Heather's wearing it in the blue. Like, like all those like seemingly high stakes things that were low stakes, or like, oh, I did or didn't get into my dream college. Like, oh, like the world is over. Sorry, that I guess that's more stakes than imposter syndrome. But the things that bothered me, like, oh, are they going to know that I'm not wearing like a nice purse, or that this or that, and oh, I feel so, and now I'm like, I don't know, I'm getting too old for this.
Yeah.
But I still, like, I was just texting with my agent a couple of days ago, and I was expressing admiration for one of her writers. I'm like, oh my God, he's so good. But I'm like, I'm afraid if I meet him at a party, he's going to be like all snobby and, like holier than thou. And it was just so dumb that as a grown ass woman, I still am like, oh my God, I have imposter syndrome as a writer, Sometimes when I enter certain academic spaces, I'm not a traditional academic. I mean, I have a teaching job, but I've my MFA and that's it. So they're like, oh, well, in this post-colonial socioeconomic, temporality. And I'm like, Jigga, what? And, and that's awkward too, even like I joke about jeans, and I'm like, I'm over it, but actually I spent 3 hours yesterday trying to find a new cut of jeans because it's plaguing me. I'm like, oh, am I gonna be seen as a boomer? Like, but maybe that's not so bad, I don't know.
Right.
I mean, I relate to everything you just said, but it also occurred to me that there is like an international jeans conspiracy that like my whole life I thought that I would reach this pinnacle of maturity when I wouldn't care so much. And now my whole plight in life is just to not wear mom jeans. Like, it's just like I do.
But also, aren't mom jeans back in fashion though?
That's what's confusing,
right?
Right? They used to not be cool, and now they're cool.
Now
and
they're
this
cool.
is like another mark of just feeling like a constant imposter, where I think I have finally caught up to like whatever is cool, and then it's not cool anymore because something that wasn't cool when I was in high school is now cool.
Right.
Exactly. I'm like, we already solved a lot of these problems, like, and then yet it's like we're in this postmodern moment where we're deconstructing everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Givens, things that we thought we solved. Yeah. Apparently, like ankle or mid calf socks are back.
I've seen that.
I'm like,
yeah,
I know, and I'm like, I just read that in a thing wherever we're getting our news lately, which is nowhere, right? It's just like in the ether,
right?
And I'm like, oh damn it! Like I just stocked up on like a 3-pack of the ankle socks, and I'm like, oh. So these are all like micro and macro things that are causing more of the feeling of being an imposter in society or an acceptable member.
It's the mid-calf sock with the sandal as well, which I mean, for a long time that was a no-go, and now we're leaning into that's high fashion now. So
Greg, I feel like you are on top of these trends. You're like dropping knowledge about the mom jeans, about the mid-calf sock, and so forth. Maybe we should just all take our lessons and cues from you.
It's just are you following Instagram?
I'm not. I'm desperate.
Platforms that we should know about?
I'm desperate to stay relevant in my middle age. I don't know. It probably comes off as it's probably not a good look, but try and keep an eye peeled for things.
Well, just going back, Patricia, to something you talked about when you were talking about like academia and feeling imposter syndrome there, because I really relate to that, as well as in the publishing world. And, this kind of idea that writers and writerly people and academics are snobby, which, I have found to be true in some situations, but not all. And, I've kind of started to question myself, like, where does that feeling come from? Because more often than not, when I'm around other writers or other academics, they feel the same way. I mean, this is why we started this podcast, is that we're finding that, like, majoritively, people who are creative have these kind of feelings of not quite fitting in, or like they're going to say or do the wrong thing. So, I guess I'm just putting it out to Greg as well. Like, did you guys always have this kind of idea, feeling that there was like a certain pretension or snobbiness, with writers and academics? And where did it come from? And how true is it from your point of view?
Yeah, Greg, I'm curious to hear your take, if you've got a hot or a lukewarm take. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes lukewarm is what we can really hope for. I mean, for me, I don't have a teaching experience, and I'd like to follow up with you after this. But I mean, I'll give you my short answer, which is that I'm intimidated by everything around publishing. So when we first got in, Liz had worked in-house in publishing, so. Like you were, Liz, for me, you were kind of a beacon, especially in those first couple of years with the first couple of books, of figuring out, okay, how does all of this work? What are the mechanics of this? I've never really felt like, as I still kind of feel like a reader first, even before a writer, because that's how I learned how to write. I didn't do an MFA. I feel like I'm hacking my way through this thing blindly, and we've arrived. So I'm already kind of predisposed to feeling intimidated by all of this process. I finally maybe gotten
It
to
says like the best-selling author, The Woman Inside, like translated everywhere, and yeah.
We just listen. I mean, Liz and I just talked about this. We were at Thriller Fest recently, and we watched conversations with like Dennis Lehane and Louise Penny and all these incredible, again, highly decorated authors who just still talked about that and bandied that around. So I would say, I think, probably for creatives, as you both have touched on earlier in this conversation, it's not like you ever really get over it. You maybe figure out better ways to manage it. Patty, with you, I'm curious, because again, you are specifically in an academic setting. Do you feel like, do you run into situations where you feel like there is still that gatekeeping mentality?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And I think, so I worked in publishing too, Liz. Like, yeah, we're both, I guess, recovering publishing people.
Yes.
And I worked my first job was at Columbia University Press, so in academic publishing. And even jobs within the company, like I started as an editorial intern, and editorial is always like, oh, this like rarefied, lofty position.
Yeah.
But then I was a publicity assistant, and that's like seen as more down market. At the time, we're publishing like monographs about like, the Soviet regime between like 3 years of history, and monographs with like a print run of 10. These are like $80 books. Like nobody's reading them, no offense, except for like the person who wrote it and their thesis committee advisors. I'm sorry to throw shade at like those people, but I kind of think it's punching up in a weird way. And then when I worked in publishing, I worked for Random House, which was so esteemed, but I worked for a commercial imprint within Random House. So the one that like made money for the company, but didn't win the awards. And so then there was like a weird rivalry there too. And and then even from there, like being a published author, oh, which imprint are you published with? Okay. And I think I think all of this comes from, right, the pie is so small. The slice of pie is so small. It's not even a whole pie, right? And then it just shrinks, or it's a mini pie and it just keeps shrinking. And so I think that's one reason. It's stemmed out of scarcity. And I think too, it's I think gatekeepers, I think to some extent, also like my cocktail party guy, right? Like, hey, you write my book. Like, imagine if like the floodgates open and all those guys, all those schmoes like came marching in. And I feel like publishing and maybe academia as well. And yeah, academia as well. They're like, oh, we can't let those people who like don't know, who don't like gerundized nouns or something, that they don't belong in these spaces. But I think academia, I think sometimes, I get frustrated when I read academic journal articles, which I really don't do very much. It's almost like they're bandying about a certain language that's very exclusive and can only be understood among people in that specific area of expertise, like that sub expertise within the expertise. Right. And I remember a philosopher colleague of mine who has her PhD and everything, so I felt like an imposter compared to her. She gave a presentation, and her fellow colleagues like dinged her for being too accessible, and which is actually, she was trying to do some crossover appeal. And I feel like, I don't know, for me as a writer, I spend so much of my life not being able to understand people on a language level. My parents and I don't even have the same mastery in the same language.
Hmm.
So I feel like writing should be to elucidate and not to obfuscate, which I feel like sometimes the worst intention academics and even writers, novelists can do,
I love that.
which drives me nuts, but I try not to read that. And there's so much else out there we can read.
For sure. That's a really great, I'd never thought of it quite like that, but that's a really elucidate rather than obfuscate. That's such a
I
great
love that.
breakdown of that. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and I'm sure you've gotten this question before, but we brought it up earlier, the kind of getting an MFA versus not, and that contributing to maybe some feelings of less than. Both Greg and I, neither of us got an MFA. Do you have any wisdom about that? And yeah, what do you think about that?
I've heard talks of that Minjin Lee gave. She's the author of Pachinko, huge global bestseller and phenomenon. And she doesn't have an MFA, and she has talked about that. She's like, and she has felt she didn't. I don't think she used the word imposter, but it was that same feeling of, am I worthy? Do I belong? On her long journey as a writer. Everything I learned about how to write a novel came after I did my MFA. Some of it was self-taught. Some of it, I was taking classes at Grub Street, which is a writing organization in Boston. And yeah, I feel like my MFA just taught me how to write pretty sentences, but it didn't teach me how to string them together into like the mechanics of a larger story. And that's what I feel like, Greg and Liz, what you do so well, on top of mastery on the micro level, but in terms of thinking about a structure, thinking about tension and plot, and thinking about how you're making characters move through dynamically, move through space, and keeping that taut suspension throughout, like that is a skill set that I think it behooves all writers to know, and that you both pull off so beautifully. So like, I hope, I don't know if you have like crib sheets on that.
Thank you. No, it's very nice to hear. I feel like you touch on something interesting, which is that I think a lot of times, and I think it permeates all of those things we're talking about with the academic gatekeeping and this sort of importance on sort of genre, or kind of, you're sort of stratifying different things in literature and in fiction, right? And it's like, I feel like a lot of times the intellectual snobbery is more of a defense mechanism, and it actually takes just away from sort of good holistic storytelling, in the name of being kind of this elitist kind of mindset.
I love that, Greg, because I feel like that's such a generous reading of the writers. And I should think of it that way. Oh, it's a defense mechanism. They're insecure. I'm like, oh, it's just because he's inherently a jerk. They are inherently awful people. That's why they make me feel so crummy.
Yeah, right,
I'm like such a dum-dum as I'm reading their pages. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking too, when you were talking about publishing, and I started as a publicity assistant. I actually was told by a family friend who was a longtime editor that if I wanted to be a writer, that I shouldn't be an editor, that I should go into marketing or publicity. And I don't know necessarily that advice was good, bad, or other. But it brought me to publicity. And the first thing I noticed was kind of the hierarchy caste system that existed, where editorial, was like rarefied air, and publicity was like, just kind of us flitting around with, press releases, which is me botching a quote from Bridget Jones' diary. And of course, Bridget Jones was like one of the first literary representations of book publicists. And I hadn't made the connection until you were talking about this, that also exists within the genres, as much as it does with imprints and departments with imprints, where I think, being at that cocktail party with that obnoxious guy, there's also the literary writer from Knopf or FSG, talking to maybe a mystery thriller writer who's a hybrid published author or self-published. And then there's this kind of sense of superiority, inferiority that I think is, really short-sighted for all the reasons we're talking about. But I also think it's changing because so many other ways to publish have happened.
Mm.
And at Thriller Fest, as Greg mentioned, there were so many writers who are publishing their own works or doing hybrid publishing or changing publishers, traditional publishers, because they're not getting what they want out of their original ones. And they're doing really well, and they're finding a way to support, their work and their genre. I think in some cases better than maybe their traditional publishing experiences if they had them.
Mm.
So I feel optimistic and excited that there's more opportunity to kind of like break out of these like old ideas, that I think publishing has kept around for way too long. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I'm so glad that these writers are finding their outlets. I think it was so funny. I spoke at a high school in the Bronx, and it was like a bunch of, I think, sophomores and juniors in high school, and one girl, I can say girl because she's under 18. She's like, "Oh, well, I'm an author of like 4 books and blah blah blah." And I'm like, "Whoa!" And every question from this young group was like, "Well, how do I get an agent? How do I get published? Like, how do I, there were good questions too, and they were engaged, but I was just so like, oh, like, let's talk about craft first. Let's talk about how to be a better writer than like, how am I going to get, published and so forth. And I think one thing that people don't tell, Liz, you and I, having worked in publishing, we know this, but your track record follows you and it haunts you, right? So you can only, publishing loves a virgin, right? They love someone with a clean slate. And I sometimes I worry, if people are self-publishing too soon, and then they don't realize, oh shoot, I have to do all my own editing, all my own marketing, all my own publicity. I have to suddenly become like a distro channel. I have to be a salesperson. I have to like hire a cover designer or draw it myself. Like, holy bleep, there's so much that goes into it. And then your sales, if the outreach, like if you're not able to get certain level of sales, then that record, you've got that on your record. And that's why I am so happy when cases do break out, because I think publishing does have a lot of problems, and they do gatekeep very strongly. When I left publishing to go to grad school to write my first novel, Re Jane, a senior editor, very esteemed, he knew about my Jane Eyre, my Korean American Jane Eyre novel project, and he's like, he's like, Patty, I worry that there's no market for like ethnic literature, and he told me this, and it was almost a decade before my first novel was actually published, because it just takes freaking forever to write a book, and those words really haunted me. And I think about, well, maybe what if I had been gate kept in that way, or maybe there were other ways that I have been gate kept, the novels I could not publish that I wrote and I could not publish. And I don't know, that's my I like ambivalent feelings about self-publishing. But Liz, it's so great to hear that you met colleagues who like found success with it and found a model, because then that meant they found their audience, and they wrote something that touched people, and they found those people. And that's all we can hope for as writers.
Yeah. I mean, and you make a really good point too, that there's the premature self-publishing, like the impatience, the authors, younger authors, or maybe not younger, who are just like, they want it out, they want to be published, and they don't necessarily know everything that goes into it. The people I was kind of speaking of are experienced, seasoned writers who have had like a whole variety of experiences.
Well, I should be like the 50 Shades of Grey author, and then I'm like eating my hat,
Right. But yeah, I think, what you were saying really got me thinking that the advice that I love to hear and give when writers are like saying, how do I get published? How do I get an agent? It's really, you said it beautifully. Like, what about the craft? It's like, do you want to be are you a writer, or do you just want to be an author? Do you like, what's your intention? Because I think, when you're writing with this kind of idea of what it's going to be like once you're published, you're picturing, if you're like thinking about your acknowledgement pages and your comments at your first book event before you've like gotten through the first chapter, it can be problematic because, I think my experience, our experience, and a lot of other authors' experiences is it's not what you think it will be when you get published, in good and bad ways. And it really is like the writing, the experience of writing the book. At least in our experience, I think that is what is so fulfilling and what we keep coming back to. And I think if you are a writer who is just kind of thinking about the end result, it can be, disenchanting, and maybe you won't write another book, or, maybe not even finish the book you're writing. So I love that you brought up the kind of critical element of craft,
Absolutely.
over business.
Right.
Thank you. I think it's hard not to. And Liz, you and I, as former publicists, we're always thinking about like, what's our press release going to look like? What's the pitch? What's the one sentence email subject heading when this book is going out there and getting sent to the Times or the Guardian or wherever else, or GMA. And it can be hard to deprogram that. But yeah, I don't know. I think as you were talking, I'm remembering like very good advice that the writer Jennifer Finney Boylan gave to me. We were both speaking at the same conference, and we were at a dinner together. And I asked her, I'm like, she's a Times columnist or contributing writer, written both fiction, memoir, and she said, "Look, there will always be people who are like more successful than you, but aren't as paraphrasing, aren't as good as you, or don't write as well, or like overinflated success, and then there will always be people who have less success than you but who are better writers." And when I heard that, that really touched me, in that, okay, it's always relative, and it's this kind of shifting scale, right? Like, okay, we had imposter syndrome when we were 17 and trying to get out of Dodge, or trying to get a prom date. We had imposter syndrome when we were 30 and trying to break, or whatever age, trying to break into publishing. We had imposter syndrome at Thriller Fest last week. I had imposter syndrome. I went to like a literary gala last week, and I'm like, oh, I'm like, oh, I lost a Colson Whitehead, whatever.
He'll intimidate everybody.
It's a good person to lose to.
Yeah,
that's winning in my book.
It's an honor to be nominated.
Exactly. And so I when I think about it in terms of that relativity scale, it does help with that kind of crippling, that overwhelming feeling of feeling like an imposter, of feeling like, oh my gosh, what's the point? Like, I don't even belong. Like, or it's so stupid that I'm like working on the craft. I'm like trying to make these nice sentences, or I'm trying to like write the scene really well, or really show what the character's feeling, and keeping a secret from this other character in this artful way. And people are like, oh, I'd rather just like, I don't know, like criticize the length of their socks on TikTok.
Right.
So what's the point? But So Liz, as you were talking, I was thinking about that paraphrased quote from Boylan.
That relativity is so great to think about too.
For sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious about something, Patty. So you've written, this is very impressive to me, that you can write across both YA and adult in your novels thus far. I'm curious, in terms of the conception and the execution, was that something, did you kind of know you wanted to dip your toe, let's say, into YA and then figured the story out? Or was it more that you had a story you wanted to tell and then figured out, okay, this works better in YA versus this particular other story works better in adult, let's say?
This sounds hokey, but I think a story and its characters tell you how they want their stories to be told. And I think it's kind of the same way when, I think all of us have probably bopped around in different apartments, different homes. And I think sometimes the home, the architecture, whatever, or the lack thereof, tells you how it wants to be lived in, or decorated, or so forth. I did not set out to write YA. I did not grow up really with the genre. Right. I remember, Liz, I wonder if we'd overlapped at Random House, but I think it was it 2005 or 2006 when Marcus Zusak published The Book Thief. And that was such a big moment. I was working on the adult side, but it was such a big moment for Random House Children's. But ironically enough, that book had been published as an adult novel in Australia. And only when it came to the US market was it then like marketed as YA or, children's lit. And I think about that. So to some extent, it's kind of arbitrary. I did have to, so I didn't grow up reading, YA it wasn't a thing. There was no Hunger Games when I was coming of age. And when I started teaching at American University, like more than half of my students were all, I'm like, what are you reading? What do you want to write? They're all like, we read YA, we want to write YA. And I'm like, oh shoot, as an educator, I had to teach myself. Yeah. I had to teach myself so I could teach them how they could do what they wanted to do versus like, how can we all write like Raymond Carver, how can we all, which is what all my so you saved yourselves a whole chunk of change and time by not going to an MFA. Cause they're all like, how do you write like Raymond Carver? I like Raymond Carver's writing, but like, I'm not a Raymond Carver. So yeah, you just saved yourselves. And I would I started with their recs and just kind of went down a rabbit hole. And I loved how like no BS the voice was, like how fresh it was. Yeah. It felt like the character was talking to the reader. Yes. So that's what pulled me. And I did have this story, the story of Alejandra's father, coming of age during the Dirty War in Argentina. Yes. Yeah. It's like dreams of being a jazz musician. And I wrote that novel, did research, worked on that for a decade, and I couldn't sell it. And that was heartbreaking. I thought my career was over, Speaking of imposter syndrome, or not even imposter syndrome, just feeling like an imposter. Mm-hmm. And then I studied it. I saw that there was like a 60-page tack on told from the voice of Juan Kim's daughter. Yeah. And that I had thrown away like a couple of years ago, a couple of years before into the process. And I was like, oh, let me look at these. Like it was like 50 or 60 pages. Yeah. And I just leaned into that voice, and then I'm like, oh, this is YA. So now I've got to understand more of the conventions, how to get that voice down and so forth. Wow. And in a bit of a fun fact, so all my novels are linked. So in Read Jane, the first adult novel, there's like a stock boy, that works in Jane's uncle's store. His name is Juan Kim. He is Papi in Imposter Syndrome. And and Jackie O, the new book, she has a cameo in Imposter Syndrome. She's like the sandwich girl. Right. So they're all like, part of this. I don't know, Patricia Park multiverse.
We also have a multiverse. In fact, Greg did an amazing Easter egg of a character from the E.G. Scott books in our upcoming book, which is written under our names. And, I think it also gives the reader like a special nod, like if you know, and it's great to see in this particular character because you've seen like where they started professionally and where they've ended up. But I think it's like the things we do as writers for ourselves, and in Greg and my case for each other, to kind of like, have these little Easter eggs. It's fun. Yeah. It keeps...
Oh my God. I love that. I love Easter eggs. I love planning them. I love finding them. Mm-hmm. So what's the pub date for the new book?
January.
Yeah. January. What's the title?
Trust Issues.
Oh, great. And can I ask, speaking so on theme with the Imposter Hour, but why the switch from E.G. Scott to using your real names, that's so interesting. And it's almost like you're doing the opposite. Like you're now revealing yourself.
Yeah. It's a great question because I think it's one of the like seeds that brought this podcast to fruition. We chose to do a pen name mostly because I was working in publishing, and I at that point was an associate publisher, and so I had a lot of input.
Dude, you were high up on the all hail. Oh my God.
I worked in publishing for over 20 years, and I got really lucky, got to work with some incredible mentors and moved around. And the last job I had before we published was associate publisher at Flatiron Books, which is an incredible imprint. It was one of the newer imprints of Macmillan. And, I had this fear that, if the book was going around and it had my name on it and people I worked with or people I had worked with saw it, there would be this like weird sense of, like, oh, should we read it? Should we not read it? It would be awkward if they turned it down. It just felt like if no one wanted to buy the book and I still had to go to work on Monday, it would be
awkward.
awkward. So that was really like kind of obscuring, that for the professional side, and then also combining the two of us. It was just kind of like economical to have our pen name be our first initials and Greg's middle name. But the choice to go under our own names now, I think, is a couple of reasons. But I think, and Greg, chime in, of course, our writing has changed and the tone of this book is different than the E.G. Scott books. And those you can be read as standalones, but they kind of exist in the same universe in the sense there's two detectives that appear in each case. They're in the same part of the world. And while this book has the Easter egg that I mentioned, it is a different book than the E.G. Scott books. And I think that this is both an effort to kind of rebrand us and maybe broaden our readership, but, also signal that, this is a different type of book than what we've written previously. It's kind of in the same genre, but there are some differences.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's so exciting. It's like kind of a new thing, but then yet you're bringing all of your experience from your past books, and tonally it will be a shift too, or
yeah.
Wow.
A bit of that, yeah.
Voice wise. Oh,
yeah.
I can't wait.
We're taking inspiration from you and kind of, switching things up midstream, which is,
You're like, pivot.
Speaking of which, do you have, is there anything, I don't know if you are at a stage where you can talk about things, but do you have anything you're working on at the moment that you can share, or anything you're thinking about? Or?
Yeah, I finished a draft of my third YA novel.
Nice.
Tentative title, Ambrosia Lee Drops the Mic.
Like
and
it.
it's
Nice.
and but I shouldn't talk about it because it's like still in draft.
Yeah.
I'm working on edits, but still. And I was I was on sabbatical. So I spent I spent a few months studying stand-up comedy to research this novel. It's about a stand-up comic. So probably did like 50 shows, 50 open mics and shows to, like method writing.
Yeah.
So you gotta get in there so that, and if I bombed, I'm like, all right, this is a win because it will help me write this scene.
Yeah.
It was a very, like disheartening time, but whatever. Sorry, that's my hound dog.
Some of the stories you hear about I have a great deal of admiration for people who go up on the stage in a stand-up format. I mean, you hear insane stories. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think you're going to continue?
Another joke again, I'd be happy.
Okay. You answered my question.
Yeah. You know what? I did, in a weird way, I kind of got bitten by the bug, but I know what it would take to get to the next level.
Right.
And I don't have that time. It would then come at the expense of my novel writing, the journalism I do, being a professor, and on the obligatory, book tour jazz hands that you have to do to promote your own work. Yeah. And so I think if I didn't have other things, if I didn't already have a profession, I'd be like, yeah, if I were in my 20s, I'm like trying things out. Sure, I would put in my 10,000 hours, but it's zero sum. It would come at the expense of something else.
Yeah.
So
is there?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, is there anything from that, like the block of stand-up dates that you did and that kind of, we'll call it research experience, what have you, was there anything that came out of that skill set that you've then brought back to your writing practice?
Yeah. I do a number of school visits, and, I try to, in my writing as well as in my public presentations, I try to imbue humor in it because I'm writing about heavy themes, and you need some kind of you need something bright to kind of cut through that heaviness. Right. And so I use humor or try to use humor to do that. I spoke at a middle school last month. I spoke at a few middle schools, and middle schoolers are like the toughest crowd to try to win over. Sure. High schoolers, they're already disaffected, so they're already just over it. But or sometimes they're empathetic enough, they'll throw you a bone by like, okay, or but middle schoolers, it's like if you say like, oh, I did this, and they're like, oh, you did it, That's even if you have the crowd engaged. And that was tough. And I think if I had never done stand-up, I think it would have, I think I would have gone home and like have stayed up and maybe cried on the, I was cried on the inside, if not on the outside a
Sure.
little.
Yes.
But I'm like, you know what? I've done these shows with like really crass people and like people saying mean things about me, at me,
Mm.
and I'm like, all right, what's a couple of and these are grown ass adults,
Right.
so
Right.
middle schoolers, all right,
Yeah.
Give me your
come
best.
at me, I
Yeah.
guess. Stuff like that. And then on the writing level, I do love, um, ending a scene with a sense of like a kind of a resonant last line, whether it's as cheesy as an image. Like I don't try not to do that too much, but some kind of line that feels like it sums up that scene or that chapter. And I was thinking about it and I'm like, oh, it's like a punchline. It's no different
Mm.
from the setup of a joke and then you get the punchline. And maybe a tag. So I've actually been leaning into that a little bit more, especially with the writing of this new novel where there are so many jokes embedded within the actual jokes,
Yes.
or jokes embedded in the narrative. So
Right.
I've been trying to do that a little bit, but to the extent that like my skill set as a non-professional
Sure.
comic allow. Yeah. So when we talk about imposter syndrome round 2 or 3 or
Yeah.
4,
There
yeah,
you go.
we'll
Yeah.
Well, you'll have to come back on when you publish that book because there's so
oh, it'd
many
be a
questions. And
delight. Thank you.
yeah, I think if you can get up in front of middle schoolers and survive, you
Oh
can
God.
do anything. And,
Absolutely.
before you told that story, getting up in front of like a audience to do stand-up set was my fear, but that's been
No,
replaced.
it's actually middle schoolers.
That's it. That'll be in my nightmares tonight.
Duty. Oh, and you say like something that just sounds a little off, and then they all start
Oh yeah.
snickering, and you're like, "What?" And it's because of
Yeah.
whatever junior high school nonsense is going on in their middle school
It's
nonsense.
just chum for the sharks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh, brutal.
I
Oh,
spoke with just to like finish out the story. I spoke with the dean of I think the dean of sixth graders at this one school I was talking to, and he went up, he was talking, and I thought he was hilarious. And in a room full of like 300 students, no one was laughing. And I asked him about it afterwards. He's like, at this point, I just make the jokes for myself. Like, I just do it for
Sure.
myself. Like,
which should be, I think, the advice for any creative endeavor. Just like do it for yourself. Because if you're
Right.
doing it for the audience, you're bound to get disappointed.
Right.
yeah, if you're doing it for the acknowledgements page,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Brings
not
me.
going to work out. Or
We can tell you've had some stand-up experience because you really did that callback beautifully.
Yes. Yes.
thank you,
Nailed it.
Yes.
thank you.
Nailed it.
Well, with our last few minutes before you came on, Patty, we were talking about our least favorite part of the writing publishing process, which is blurbs. And we wanted to get your take on it because I think it's a topic that people who've been through it have a lot of strong opinions, and then people who are about to go through it wonder what it's like. So what has your experience been with blurbs?
Yeah, I hate asking for them and I hate being asked for them. Like that doesn't sound right, but I think because I teach and I have so much student work,
Mm.
undergrad and graduate students that I have to read, and then all my syllabus planning, so all the works that I have to read for what we're teaching and what my colleagues are teaching, and then our visiting writer series, like I don't have free time to read manuscripts or to read books about to be published.
Right.
Yeah.
So I always feel like a jerk because I know so many people were very generous to me and I do what I can, but I can't.
Yeah.
Like and then I turn something down and then it gets super awkward. Like I've had to turn down a number this year and I've still committed to a handful, which is already, I don't read fast. So each manuscript takes, 10, 15 hours plus the 2 hours you're like fiddling around with the
Right.
wording. I don't know. And then now people are asking for pre-publication blurbs,
I've seen that. Yeah.
which I've been asked for over the past like 5 years, but especially in the last 2 years. And I don't know. I keep hearing that people are talking about abolishing blurbs, but then I keep being told I need to get blurbs. And then it's so awkward. Like I have to like reach out to the biggest person I know and be like, "Oh, can I have a blurb?" And they're like, "Oh," they answer however they answer, and
Sure.
then someone else is asking, "Oh, what are your what are your takes and how do we solve this?"
Yeah. It's a great
Well,
Or
question.
maybe you're like, "Blurbs, awesome, yeah,
No,
chocolate
no,
for all."
no, it's a much more in your camp. And,
Yeah.
I think we the abolishing blurbs I've been hearing for like years. So I don't know that will ever happen, because I think that's like a good example of like where the publishing industry is just like has the way they do things and they just like can't change or adapt. But yeah, I mean, it brings out all the imposter stuff again, like asking people, potentially making it awkward, knowing that people have so little time to read because they're writing or doing their day jobs or whatever the circumstances. And then, writing the blurbs themselves. It's like, how do you write a good blurb that doesn't sound like every other blurb you've ever read?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's so hard. And I will say another added layer of like discomfort with blurbs for me is like when people ask me to blurb a book that's like they're writing outside of their experience, and then I've been asked to like put my name on a work that I'm not 100% sure like I can whether that's the what kind of research they did to understand that experience outside of their own, and I'm I've had colleagues where it's like blown up in their face, where it's like they are sanctioning an experience of somebody else like appropriate, and so then it just gets even more fraught. And I'd like to think that my colleagues are always coming in with good intentions, but sometimes I don't know, that's another added layer that BIPOC writers have to think about. And it just it just makes things so it's just so fraught. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
On that happy note.
And there we are.
So no one asked Patricia for blurbs.
No,
I'm just
like
teasing.
a jerk, and I've been asked. I've turned down so many blurbs that like has. I just went to see a comedian last night. Hadi, I can't remember his last name, but he's a Queens comedian, and he said that a young upstart politician reached out to him. And she was like, "Oh, let's collaborate. I represent Queens and the Bronx, or I'm running to represent Queens and the Bronx." Her name was Alejandra, and he's like, yeah, Alexis, I'm kind of busy right now, so I'll get back to you." And then it turned out she was AOC,
Wow.
and he's like, "Oh." So there have been those blurbs too. I'm like, I just don't have time. I didn't get to them, and then they've like blown up.
Yeah. You never know.
You cannot win.
You can't win.
You cannot win in the blurb game.
Yeah, the blurb game is a zero-sum game, and you can't win, and it will only bring frustration.
Exactly. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
It really is one of those things. Well, Patty, thank you so much for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it.
This has been amazing.
It's been fantastic.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Yeah. And just to put a pin on the blurb thing, the reason why we're all here is actually because of the generosity of Jean Kwok blurbing my first novel.
Yes, that's right.
And she, when she had her most recent book launch, that's where I met you, Greg. And we had to, and so
that's right.
Therein lies the beauty and generosity.
You're right. We will leave it on a positive note with Jean Kwok, the great connector, who made this episode possible. So yes, so thank you, Jean, and thank you for all the blurbers out there who have been very kind with their time and their resources and their energy. So thank you for that. Patty, where can people find you?
I'm at patriciapark.com, but I'm mostly on Instagram of all the social media at Patricia Park 718, which is the area code for Queens.
Yeah.
Nice. There, and I'm touring all around, so just check out there or check out my site, and hopefully we'll all get to meet in person.
That sounds great.
I mean, and with your listeners.
That sounds great. Listeners, you heard it here. Patty Park. Keep an eye out, keep an ear out for her. Fantastic stuff. Very exciting. And we will be excited to have you back on with the stand-up book.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. This has been such a treat. Thank you for having me.